The DFS-194 was a rocket plane which was used for researching tailless aircraft. This design would be a precursor to the famous Me-163 Komet. Hello everyone, I'm Matt, this is Model Minutes, and join me on the workbench today as I complete a build and review of the PM Model DFS-194 in 1/72 scale. For a deeper dive inside the box to take a look at the sprues, instructions and decals, I've already completed a full unboxing video, so take a look at that one. In this video I'm going to be focusing on how this kit is to build and rounding off with a review at the end. As usual, I'll put a list of the products I used during this build on the screen here to give you an idea of the kind of things to get if you fancy having a go at this one for yourself. But without any further ado, let's get into this. As is quite normal, my first step is to remove the parts from the sprue that I need using my side cutters. This kit doesn't feature that many parts, so actually this is a relatively quick step. Any rough areas of plastic or excess flash can be carefully removed using a sharp knife or a sanding stick. Tamiya extra thin cement will be my glue of choice for this particular build. The first step was to assemble the various cockpit parts. There aren't a great deal of cockpit parts, so this was a very quick step. When all of these had been glued inside of the relevant fuselage half, I then decided to paint them. This Humbrol number 240, which is an RLM02 colour, was used as the cockpit interior. I didn't bother to thin this paint down, I instead applied it straight from the pot. After this, Humbrol 32, which is a dark grey, was carefully painted onto the control panel and a few other select details. This is pretty much it for the cockpit, so it's time to close up the fuselage halves. The fit is generally okay, but I will clean up the seams using a sanding stick. After this, I joined the two wings onto the fuselage sides, but unfortunately the fit here is not so good and there is a small gap at the wing roots. To hide this gap, I'm deciding to use some of this Ammo MIG putty surfacer. This was painted onto the relevant areas and built up in layers to try and fill in the gaps. When it was dry, I would carefully sand it down as best I can to try and hide the gaps, and give a more flush level between the two parts. Moving on to the clear part now, there is a bit of flash which needs to be cut away. This isn't the best clear part that I've ever seen, but it is, for the most part, fairly usable. The only problem is that when I was doing my unboxing, I didn't realise that actually one of the corners has been chipped off, and it's not inside the box. So what I'm going to have to do is make my own replacement using some extra pieces of plastic I've got lying around. I carefully cemented the cockpit canopy into place, and then using a small piece of plastic from a bit of clear packaging, I carefully cut it to the correct size and then added it into the relevant place to try and hide the fact that the corner of the cockpit canopy was missing. This isn't ideal, as there will be a seam across the plastic part, but I think it'll do for now. With that done, the next step was to mask the canopy. Unfortunately, the design of the canopy means that all of the canopy framework is actually moulded on the inside, which is a little bit difficult to work with. I would have much preferred that the canopy framework be moulded on the outside, because this would be much easier to do. So with this in mind, I simply applied tape to the relevant areas and cut it to more or less the shape of the panels of the windows, using reference images to try and get them about right. But it's not going to be perfect, as I haven't got any lines to follow. With that done, this part was added onto the nose. I'm pretty sure this is a pitot tube. And now I can move on to the landing gear. Much like the Me-163, this actually comes with a cradle with wheels on, which would fall away after takeoff. However, there are some sink marks which I need to address. These were filled in with more of the putty surfacer and then sanded smooth. The rocket nozzle on the back of the aircraft isn't particularly neat either, so I decided that I would drill this out. And now it's time to prime. I'm going to spray all of these parts with this fine surface primer from Tamiya. This is the white variety. I'm going for white because it's a light colour and it will help with the subsequent layers of paint, because they are going to be light too. When that was done, I mixed up this K-Colors Ivory primer and some Vallejo yellow. These were mixed in roughly equal quantities and loaded into the airbrush. This model kit actually comes with two paint schemes, one being an all metal version and the other being a painted version in a light yellow. So that's the version I'm trying to replicate. When that was dry, it was time to move on to the decals. There is a decal sheet included, and you can see here that we've got some wood grain panels. These wood panels are being used on my particular version of the paint scheme. However, all of the crosses that you can see are actually fictional and are completely up to you whether you include them or not. It would appear from the painting instructions that if you do the metallic version of this aircraft, it doesn't require any decals at all, unless of course you want to include them as a fictional option. The decals were soaked in warm water and then allowed to separate from the backing paper. As is quite typical with my builds, Micro Set and Sol will be used to help settle the decals onto the surface of the plastic. Micro Set was applied to the relevant areas, the decals were carefully slid into place and positioned, and then after a little while, some Micro Sol from the red bottle was brushed over the top to further soften the transfers onto the plastic and help blend them into the surface details. These wood grain decals are actually alright and apply to the model fairly well, but I did have to trim a little bit of the excess decal film away just to make sure it didn't overlap on the rear edge of the wing. And when that was cured, it was time to apply a varnish. I'm using this Satin 135 from Humbrol, and this was simply sprayed over the entire aircraft to help seal in those transfers. When that was dry, I thinned down some blue-grey enamel wash. There are some recessed details on this aircraft, there are a few recessed panel lines here and there, and I opted to apply a really thin wash to this aircraft to try and bring out those details. However, these details are very shallow, so may not be particularly visible in the finished build. Any excess wash can be carefully removed in the direction of airflow to give a slightly more realistic look. Part of me kind of wishes that I had rescribed these panel lines because they are very shallow and just aren't particularly noticeable in the end. With that done, some Humbrol 62, which is a leather kind of colour, was actually used to simulate wood. There is a wooden skid on the bottom of the aircraft and I used it on this to try and make it appear as if there was some wood grain by streaking the paint along the yellow base coat. After this, some Humbrol 243, which is an RLM 72 colour, was painted onto the hubs of the wheels, which are yet to be added to the model. Vallejo black was then carefully applied to the tyres. Some of this Humbrol precision poly was then used to glue the wheels onto the cradle having previously been painted the same colour as the hubs of the wheels. I then glued the cradle onto the bottom of the rocket plane. Vallejo aluminium was used to carefully paint the pitot tube on the nose of the aircraft. And the final step here is to carefully peel away all of those homemade canopy masks to reveal a reasonable attempt at masking the canopy. And it is at this point where we could consider the aircraft complete. However, in my opinion, it looks a bit dull. It's not a very big model, it's not particularly complicated. I think though I can probably go a little bit further and make this a little more visually interesting. So with that in mind, what I've got here is a circular display base. It's simply a piece of laser cut MDF. I painted this with some generic brown paint, mixed in with some matte Mod Podge. This was then sprinkled with a variety of different scatters, primarily some static grass, but also a few other bits and pieces mixed in to give a bit of variety. I then added the aircraft and some suitably painted figures. The civilian figures are from a Decals Railway Workers set, which I have slightly modified to make them look a little bit more appropriate. whilst there is also a Luftwaffe figure from the Airfix Vintage Classics Luftwaffe Personnel set in 1/76 scale. A couple of 3D printed crates were also added for a little bit of extra detail. And with that, now I am actually going to call this project complete. Okay, so where do I begin with this kit? I suppose I'll start with the good things and the things that I like. So this doesn't feature that many parts and you can make relatively quick progress. I checked my little diary, my journal, and this only took me 4 days to complete in between other commitments such as work and family. So that was a big positive. It's a bit of a mojo build really. I like that it comes with 2 different paint schemes to pick from, however you only really need decals for one of them. And bearing that in mind, you only actually need 4. Granted, you do get them printed to a nice quality, and you do get some extra ones for adding as fictional emblems if you'd like to do so, but for me, I've put them in my stash and I'll use them on a project in the future, no doubt. I like that this kit features some more modern detailing, such as recessed panel lines, however, those details are very shallow and hardly noticeable. The instructions though are printed in colour, and that's another positive as well. Unfortunately, this does mean that this brings me round to the less positive aspects of this kit. Whilst simple to assemble, the parts that are included in the kit don't feature that much in the way of detail. I didn't really like that the cockpit canopy has the frames moulded on the inside of the part, which made it much more difficult to mask. Not to mention of course the fact that mine actually was damaged, and I had to repair it with an extra piece of plastic. There is a fair amount of flash in a few places that needed to be cleaned up, and there are sink marks in various other locations which also had to be addressed. The fit of the parts is okay for the most part, but there was that gap at the wing roots which needed some attention. I think though some of these flaws can be kind of understood given when we look at the tooling age of this kit. This is a 1994 tooling, so no doubt is not up to the current standards that we expect from modern kits. But as this is not indicated on the box, it is hard to know for sure, unless you do some research. I think though the biggest problem I have with this kit is in the price. Bearing in mind what we've seen in the kit where we only get 13 parts, the recommended retail price for this kit is £8.99 at the time I'm making this video, which does seem excessively high for what you're getting inside the box, especially when we bear in mind that there are other kits within the PM model range which are bigger and feature more parts and more plastic and more decals, but retail for a cheaper price. So I'm not entirely sure what the PM model pricing policy is in regards to this particular kit. That being said, if you can find one of these kits for a much cheaper price, it may be worth having a go at if you enjoy building slightly obscure subjects. I particularly like that I added a little diorama base for this to make it look a little more interesting. But I suppose in conclusion this is a kit that is showing its age a little bit, which may well benefit from a retool, if PM does insist on selling this within their range, but they should, I think, at least address the fact that the price is a bit too high. And with that, I'm going to call this video here. Let me know down in the comments what you think of my build and whether my assessment of it was fair. As always, I'd like to give a quick shout out to my Model Club members for the extra support they give the channel. Massive thanks to these guys on screen, and if you'd like to join them or support the channel in other ways, full information is below the video. The best way to support this channel for free though is by subscribing with notifications turned on so you never miss a modelling upload. Finally though, last thing to say is a massive thank you to you, and I'll see you on the workbench again next time.